Hi, this is Lee Balcom, and I want to welcome you to this MP3, which is a recording about midlife crisis marriage. Now, the reason I'm making this recording is because you need this information if your marriage is in the midst of a midlife crisis. And I always want to get the information to people as quickly as I can. So that's why when you look at my ebook, you don't see a hardbound book. That information would take 3 or 4 more years to get to you, and you need that information now. And it's the same with that MP3. So if you're looking for a CD quality recording, you're not going to find it here. But what you are going to find is my reflections and my reactions to people who come to me on a daily basis in the midst of a marriage crisis that's often about a midlife crisis. So I want to give that information to you and give you something that you can get started with. And with that in mind, I want to talk a little bit about what we mean by midlife marriage crisis. You've heard the term midlife crisis, and generally speaking, that's exactly what we're dealing with in the midst of a marriage. And so the midlife crisis of somebody becomes a midlife marriage crisis. There are a couple of symptoms that you may be familiar with. First of all, you may have heard a couple of phrases from your spouse. One that's very powerful is, "I love you, but I'm not in love with you." That's a very common phrase that comes about in the midst of a midlife crisis. There's kind of a reorientation to the person in crisis, and they come away feeling like they're not in love with that person anymore. We'll get to that in a little bit. The other one is when a spouse comes and says, "I'm just not happy." And they may be completely unknown to the other person, but they come and say, "I've been unhappy for years," or "I'm just not happy anymore and I need to make a change." Those kind of comments, once more, are often symptoms of a midlife marriage crisis. Now, another one that comes out in a little different way, it's about the same as that not happy, is when somebody comes and says, "I want something more." In other words, they're kind of looking as if there's something better out there than what they already have. They're thinking in their own mind that there has to be something that completes them a little bit more than what they're already in. And this is really getting to the heart of what we're talking about when we say a midlife crisis. A midlife crisis is based in 2 different things. The first thing is mortality. When somebody realizes that they're going to die, in other words, if there's been an illness, maybe they've experienced an illness, or somebody around them has experienced an illness, or a friend has gotten sick, or even a friend has died, a parent has died, something has brought to mind the fact that we all have to face one day, we are all going to die. And when we have that realization, suddenly life changes. Our goals in life change. We reorient what it means, because up until then, we're kind of on autopilot. We're living as if we're going to live forever. And when we live as if we're going to live forever, we don't put any priorities on what we want to get out of life. And suddenly we have to change that, because our mortality, the fact that we're going to die, is suddenly in our minds. So a midlife crisis is created, first of all, by realization somewhere, perhaps even deep down inside somewhere. It may not be a conscious realization that someone can say, "Oh, wow, I just realized I'm going to die." They may just have a sudden realization that life is passing them by. They have a sense that life is going on and they're not catching up with where they want to be. And in the midst of that, they have this other need that pops up, and that's a need for meaning. What's this all about? Now, meaning, you can think of meaning as being this really deep thing that people are going to go out and want to change the world. Maybe some people, is life giving me what I expected? Is life giving me what I wanted? Because most of us, we kind of come out of our education, whatever education level that was, and we hit into a career. We get a job, we start working, we start a family. We start down this path without ever thinking about what that path is about and why we're on that path. One day you wake up, wherever you are in your job, wherever you are in your life, and you say, "Is this really what I was aiming for? Is this really going where I thought it would take me?" And oftentimes that's not the case. We find ourselves at a different place than we thought we would be, or perhaps not as far as we thought we would be. Lots of different places that suddenly we realize we're not where we need to be. When that happens, we end up in a crisis. That's the midlife crisis. Put together somebody's realization that they only have so much more to live. Add that with a sense that there has to be something more to this life, and you have the makings of a crisis. There are lots of them are healthy. Some of them are not healthy. An unhealthy response to a midlife crisis is to just up and leave the family, up and leave a job, buy a new car, find a new wife or husband, find a new house, find a new place to live. The problem with all those solutions is whatever we do externally to make a change, we take ourselves with us. So whatever's going on inside of me, even if I have a new car, it's still me in that car. If I find a new house, it's still me in that house. If I find a new spouse, it's still me in that marriage. So we have a struggle, an unhealthy way of finding a solution to a midlife crisis that's bound in external things. The problem is a midlife crisis is always, always, always internal. As much as we would like to blame it on something else, as much as we would like to blame it on what the job is not giving us, what a spouse is not giving us, a midlife crisis is always an internal process. And until it is answered internally, it's going to create more and more problems because we keep trying to answer it in ways that will not get to the base fact that we have to deal with our own mortality and that we have to deal with our own sense of meaning in life. That's why a midlife marriage crisis is so destructive. In the midst of a midlife crisis, someone decides that the way to solve that crisis is to go outside the marriage. That's always a dead-end trap. So we have people who are finding themselves with this growing sense of disenchantment with the marriage, growing sense of disenchantment with life, growing sense of discomfort, whatever you want to term it. And so part of what comes out of that is this sense that they have to find it. So then we come up with these reasons that people say that they have to leave a marriage. That's the not in love with you, I'm not happy with you, I want something more. All of those are questioning what's going on outside instead of trying to answer that question from an internal perspective. The internal perspective is where they have to go. It's just not where we want to go. We always want to find as a first thing that we're not at fault, that we want to see that there is something else at fault, something else that's creating this, instead of us having to meddle through, to work through those emotions. And that's part of what we have as the crisis of a midlife crisis. You may not be in a midlife crisis while your spouse may be in a midlife crisis. In fact, I would put money on the fact that if you're listening to this audio, chose this audio in the beginning, maybe you finally got a spouse to listen, or maybe you're the spouse who's decided to listen. But if you're the one who was seeking out this audio, I can promise you that it's your spouse that's having a crisis. So you're the one who's feeling this pressure of someone saying to you, I don't want to be in this marriage, I don't love you anymore, I want something more out of life. So just to complete this diagnostic piece of the puzzle, if you're looking at a spouse and you're beginning to think that perhaps there's a midlife crisis at hand, and you're beginning to hear these things about how they want something more, let's assume that you're in the midst of a midlife marriage crisis. Now, once you know that, we need to talk about how you're going to respond to that, because in the end, that's really what we're after. How are you going to respond to this midlife crisis in a way that does more healing and less damage? Because part of what happens whenever there's a crisis is that the other person, whoever feels that lack of sense of control, whoever's not having the midlife crisis, is suddenly left trying to figure out how to respond to the other person. Usually when we're responding to some sense of crisis, we have two distinct responses. It's the fight or flight response. Now, in this, dealing with this crisis, I'm talking about not fighting with your spouse, but fighting for your marriage. And so we go into kind of a panic phase. We go into this going and reading all the books, going to seminars, listening to audios about marriage, doing all these things, churning and churning, having to sit down and have these talks with our spouse, try to talk it out, try to do all these things to repair the relationship. And we do it in such desperate ways that gets us into trouble. So in the midst of that fighting for the marriage, we have the situation where the other person becomes overwhelmed with all the activity that's going into the marriage. Here they're saying, I'm not sure I want to be married, and suddenly the person is giving them all kinds of attention. So first of all, the fight response tends to get us into more trouble because it only reaffirms what our spouse already thinks, that they have to get out of this marriage. The second response is the flight response, and that can be more of a paralysis. It could be either I'm getting myself out of the situation right now, or I'm going to pretend like nothing's going on. both responses are based in fear. In fact, all of these responses are based in fear. They're responses that we have that are kind of in our gut, the feelings running around. And so when that happens, we suddenly are responding from a fear base, not a rational base. And that's the problem. A fear base of response always gets us into more trouble. A rational base at least gives us a place to grow towards, a chance to move towards something that's more helpful. So if you're feeling that sense of flight, that would be, I'm going to get out of this marriage right now. I rush to the attorney, I start filing the paperwork, I'm acting on this, and maybe that will kind of get some response from the other person. The other is, I'll do nothing. I'll just sit here and pretend like nothing's going on, and pretend like they're not saying that they're not in love with me, and all those kinds of things. Doesn't work. Again, part of the problem is what we do whenever there is a fear situation is what we'll do in this fear situation. And so we're replicating the whole problems that have come up throughout the marriage, and that continues to create the crisis for the spouse. If they have proof that, 1, you're always trying to fix me, or 2, you're always trying to leave me, or 3, you're never attending to the marriage, you're already stuck in the same place you've been all along. And part of a midlife crisis is a wake-up call. And that's what I want you to hear from this, is there is a healthy part of what's going on in this. There's a healthy part in saying, wow, I'm going to die. That's an important part, because once we acknowledge that we're going to die, then we can live fully. So our spouse is in the midst of a growth process, and we can be in the midst of that growth process once we acknowledge that we're going to die. The second piece is meaning. If meaning has been missing from your marriage, from your life, this is a great time to put it back in, because your spouse may be saying, I'm not happy, and you may be resisting the fact they're trying to leave the marriage. But if you step back and think about it, you may recognize that you haven't been as happy as you should be either. In other words, they're saying something of truth. Even if they're doing it in very unhealthy, very destructive ways, there can still be a truth to it. And so there's a healthy part to this midlife crisis that we don't want to miss. So if we're always responding the way we've been responding, we'll continue to get the same thing we've gotten, and we'll miss the fact that there's a growth opportunity in the midst of this crisis. So the first thing I want to say is, if you find that this is the crisis going on, first thing to do is do not panic. We've already talked about those fear responses, so don't panic. And initially, do nothing. That doesn't mean bury your head in the sand, but do nothing. Don't leave. Don't consult attorneys right off. Don't sit down and say, we've got to solve this. Back off a little bit. Give your spouse some room to try to figure out where their new compass bearing is heading in life. Because where their compass bearing is heading in life is somewhere that they're going to need to follow. You can't keep them trapped if they're in the midst of a marriage crisis. They're going to feel the need to move forward. And so the other thing you're going to want to do at the same time is to work on yourself. You see, your spouse is responding to something that's going on internally. What's going on internally is a healthy process. That healthy process is something that you can look at. So start looking at things about, are there areas that you need to change your life? Are there ways that you need to bring more meaning into your life? More ways of maybe making life more significant, because as your spouse is discovering, you're discovering too, there is an end game to this. There is an end to our lives, and we want to make it a significant life. And so if you keep that in mind, you can ask the question, what are the things that I've always wanted to do? What are the things that I need to be working on for myself? Because part of what's happened is, as your marriage has continued on and become stagnant, both of you have probably lost track with working on yourself, on growing as individuals as well as growing as a couple, and suddenly you find yourself at the point where it's stagnation. There's one of my favorite quotes is by the person that Ray Kroc, who was the founder of McDonald's. And Ray Kroc had this saying that they're green and growing, or red and or ripe and rotting. Green and growing, or ripe and rotting. So the question is, are you already ripe and rotting, or have you continued to grow and to develop? Part of our life task is to always be growing, always be developing. And so as part of this process, you need to be growing and working on yourself. It does not mean that you go fill the bedside table with self-help books on marriage, but it means that you take a look at your relationship, take a look at your spirituality, take a look at your work, your vocation. And by vocation, I mean, what is your calling in this world? What are you here to do? What's your purpose? Start taking a look at those things. Are there hobbies that you want to pursue? Are there ways that you can become more interesting in your life, more interested in your life, not just interesting to other people, but more interesting to yourself, and become more interested in life and continue to be growing? That's a crucial part here, because as you grow and you develop, you allow your spouse to grow and develop. They have the same opportunity for developing themselves, and as they do that, that's the proper way. That's the healthy way to deal with the midlife crisis. And they may not even be aware of that yet. They may still be at that sense of, this isn't what I want, but I don't know what to do about it. And you can lead the way in showing that what you do with it is you start to learn about what you need in life, what you want in life, and you start to grow and develop yourself, so that that's an ever-growing sense of yourself, your self-identity, where you are in the world, what you want out of life, and they can begin to grow towards that too. And finally, you work on connection. You work on connection in the marriage. That means that you work on being friends again, because one of the most common things I hear is that people want to leave a marriage because they no longer have a friend. This person that they were dating, fall in love with, that was a friend, is no longer their friend. And they feel alienated and lost. And so part of what we want to work on is the connection of the marriage. That means that you don't go out and have a 3-hour let's talk about our relationship talk. In fact, I would say you set aside specific talk about the relationship right now. Give that away and instead go for connection. Going for coffee, going for bike rides, going for walks, doing things that friends do as a way of reestablishing connection. Now, I will tell you this, after you've worked on that connection, and you can find lots more ways of working on that connection if you'll look in my ebook, you can still get to the point where your spouse abandons the relationship. Recognize that not every crisis is solved in healthy ways. Sometimes people choose an unhealthy way of getting through a crisis, and it's possible that no matter what you do, your spouse will continue down a destructive path of taking apart your relationship, and there may be nothing you can do to stop that. Even if that's the case, I would say that if you walk through a crisis like I have described it, where you take on your own task of growing and developing and learning, and you take on the task of trying to connect with your spouse, you will be a better person at the end of it. You will have come to the point where you have developed your life in ways that are far superior than where you were before the crisis. In other words, you have used the crisis to propel you to a new place in your development. And so even if at the end you don't get what you want in the relationship, you may find that you have a new life nonetheless. I hope that you get your relationship. I hope that you can save your relationship and get it back on course. I hope that you end up with a healthy marriage. And I hope that you end up being a healthy person because you faced a midlife crisis and you've gone through it appropriately. Best wishes to you, and I hope things turn out for the better.